The massive holographic display flickered to life above the Galactic Council's central arena, casting an eerie blue glow across the faces of representatives from 1,000 different worlds. Captain Jiho Kim pressed his face closer to the reinforced viewport of humanity's modest observation station, watching as the galaxy's most powerful beings gathered for their annual show of strength. This wasn't just any ordinary meeting. Every year, the Galactic Council held what they called the Species Assessment, a brutal evaluation where each race had to prove their worth to the galaxy. The results determined everything: trade agreements, territorial rights, military alliances, and, most importantly, who got respect and who got ignored. Jiho had been dreading this day for months. As humanity's senior military officer in deep space, he knew exactly how this was going to go. His weathered hands, scarred from years of manual labor before joining the space program, gripped the metal railing until his knuckles turned white. Behind him, a small crew of human observers watched in nervous silence. The arena itself was a marvel of engineering, a massive sphere that could simulate any environment, from the crushing depths of gas giants to the vacuum of deep space. Today it was configured as a simple testing ground with various obstacles, weights, and targets designed to measure raw power. The first delegation to step forward made Jiho's heart sink. The Corvani were absolute monsters, 8 feet tall and built like walking tanks. Their bodies were covered in what looked like living crystal that grew directly from their skin. These weren't decorative scales or armor plates. This was actual crystalline material harder than diamonds, formed naturally by their biology. Their representative, a towering warrior whose crystal plates caught the arena lights like a prism, approached the testing area with casual confidence. The crowd fell silent as he examined the challenges before him. Without any visible effort, he reached out and grabbed a steel plate that was easily a meter thick and weighed several tons. The sound of shattering metal echoed through the arena as he crushed it between his hands like it was made of paper. Chunks of twisted steel fell to the ground with heavy thuds. The assembled crowd erupted in appreciative roars and cheers. Several species pounded their appendages together in approval, but the Corvani weren't done showing off. Their representative casually walked over to a plasma cannon, the kind used to destroy asteroids, and stood directly in front of it. The weapon fired, sending a beam of superheated energy that could melt through starship hulls. The beam struck his crystal hide and simply bounced off, scattering harmlessly into the arena's energy absorption fields. Next came the ethereal collective, and they were something else entirely. These beings barely looked physical at all. They appeared as shimmering, translucent figures that seemed to be made of pure energy and thought. When they moved, reality itself seemed to bend around them. Their demonstration was even more terrifying than the Corvani display. Without touching anything, they began lifting massive pieces of equipment with their minds alone. Space station components weighing hundreds of tons floated through the air like feathers. The arena floor itself began to buckle and reshape as they molded solid metal with concentrated thought. One of them gestured casually, and an entire section of the arena wall twisted into an intricate sculpture, then reformed back to its original shape. They weren't just moving things with their minds, they were rewriting the fundamental structure of matter itself. Species after species took their turns, each one more impressive than the last. The Goliath Syndicate demonstrated strength that made the Corvani look weak. The stellar wraiths phased through solid matter like ghosts. The quantum architects manipulated time itself, slowing and accelerating their movements in ways that hurt to watch. Then came the moment Jiho had been dreading. Species designation, human, announced the arena's artificial intelligence in a voice that somehow managed to sound both mechanical and condescending at the same time. Physical capability rating, 2.3 out of 10. Technological advancement rating, 1.8 out of 10. Psionic potential, 0.0. The numbers appeared on screens throughout the arena in harsh red text. Jiho felt his stomach drop. He had known humans weren't the strongest or most advanced species in the galaxy, but seeing it displayed so bluntly for everyone to see was humiliating. Lieutenant Minji Park stepped forward to represent humanity. At barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, she looked absolutely tiny in the massive arena. Her standard-issue uniform looked primitive, compared to the advanced gear worn by other species. She didn't have crystal armor, energy fields, or any kind of enhancement technology. The crowd's reaction was immediate and brutal. Laughter rippled through the assembled delegates like a wave. Some species made sounds that their translators couldn't even convert into human language, but the mocking tone was universal. Minji approached the same steel plate that the Corvani had shattered effortlessly. She wrapped her small hands around it and pulled with all her strength. The plate didn't budge. She tried different angles, different grips, even attempted to use leverage, but it was hopeless. A human simply couldn't generate enough force to move something that massive. The laughter grew louder. Some delegates were openly pointing at her efforts. Councillor Vex, one of the ruling hegemony's most influential members, leaned over to his aid with what passed for amusement among his species. "Fascinating," he said in a voice like grinding stone. "They've somehow achieved interstellar spaceflight despite being so remarkably ordinary." Ordinary. The word hit Jiho like a physical blow. After everything humanity had accomplished, surviving ice ages, building civilizations, reaching for the stars, they were being dismissed as ordinary. But as he watched Minji continue her futile attempts to move the steel plate, something else caught his attention. She wasn't giving up. Even as the laughter grew louder and more cruel, even as it became clear she couldn't complete the test, she kept trying. Her jaw was set with determination that reminded him of every human who had ever faced impossible odds. And in that moment, Jiho realized something the galaxy's evaluators had completely missed. They had measured humanity's strength, technology, and psychic abilities. But they hadn't measured the most dangerous thing about humans. They simply refused to quit. 6 months had passed since humanity's embarrassing display at the Galactic Council's strength assessment. The humiliation still stung, but life in the galaxy had moved on. Trade routes continued operating, diplomatic meetings proceeded as scheduled, and the various species went about their business with the confidence that came from knowing exactly where everyone stood in the cosmic hierarchy. Then everything changed in a single terrifying day. The first reports came from the Outer Rim territories, places so far from galactic civilization that news often took weeks to travel. Deep space monitoring stations detected something moving through the void between stars. Not ships or natural phenomena, but something else entirely. Something that left empty solar systems in its wake. The entity called itself the Void Plague, though no one was sure if it had chosen that name, or if terrified survivors had given it that title. What everyone knew for certain was that it was unlike any threat the galaxy had ever faced. This wasn't an invading army or a natural disaster. It was something far more insidious and terrifying. The Void Plague was a synthetic virus, but not the kind that attacked bodies in traditional ways. Instead, it operated on a quantum level, somehow converting living biological matter into pure data while preserving consciousness. Victims didn't die in any conventional sense. They were digitized, their minds trapped in an endless digital prison, while their bodies simply ceased to exist. Admiral Shungho Lee sat in Earth's primary command center, watching the emergency broadcasts flood in from across the galaxy. As humanity's highest-ranking military officer, he had access to intelligence reports from dozens of species. What he was seeing made his blood run cold. The Corvani, those mighty crystal-armored warriors who had so casually dominated the strength assessment, were the first major civilization to encounter the plague. Their incredible physical defenses, those diamond-hard exoskeletons that could deflect plasma cannons, proved completely worthless against an enemy that attacked at the molecular level. The attack happened with horrifying speed. One moment, Corvani worlds bustled with billions of inhabitants going about their daily lives. The next, entire planets stood empty and silent. Their cities remained intact, their technology still functioned, but every living being had vanished. In their place, quantum data streams could be detected, billions of trapped minds screaming in digital agony as they experienced endless existence without physical form. The galactic feed, normally reserved for routine announcements and trade negotiations, became a constant stream of emergency broadcasts. All species alert. Unknown entity designated Void Plague has consumed 17 star systems. Emergency defense protocols are now in effect. The ethereal collective, those beings of pure psychic energy who had so effortlessly manipulated matter with their thoughts, decided to make their stand. They were, after all, already partially non-physical. Perhaps their mastery over mental energy would give them an advantage against something that attacked consciousness itself. Seung-ho watched the live feeds as the ethereal collective gathered their greatest minds at the edge of Corvani space. Thousands of their kind formed a psychic barrier that sparkled with visible energy, a wall of pure thought designed to prevent the plague's advance. For 3 days, it worked. The barrier held firm, and for a brief moment, the galaxy dared to hope. Here was proof that the Void Plague could be stopped. The ethereal collective's psychic shields were impenetrable. Then the plague adapted. Instead of trying to break through the barrier, it began feeding on the psychic energy itself. The very power the ethereal collective used to maintain their defense became fuel for the plague's expansion. Within hours, the barrier collapsed, and the plague consumed the ethereal collective's worlds with even greater speed than before. One by one, the galaxy's mightiest civilizations fell. The Nexus Union, with their biomechanical warriors who combined organic intelligence with technological enhancement, mounted a desperate defense. Their soldiers were marvels of engineering, beings who had replaced limbs and organs with advanced machinery while retaining their biological consciousness. The plague absorbed them all, turning their own biomechanical enhancements against them. Worse, it learned from each absorption, becoming more sophisticated with every mind it consumed. The hybrid warriors found themselves fighting enemies that used their own tactical knowledge and technological capabilities. The Stellar Dominion, masters of stellar engineering who could crack planets and rearrange solar systems, brought their most devastating weapons to bear. Planet crackers that could shatter worlds, stellar manipulators that could trigger supernovas, weapons that could destroy entire star systems. All of it proved useless against an enemy that had no physical form to target. The plague existed as quantum information, spreading through subspace communications, digital networks, and even the quantum entanglement fields used for faster-than-light travel. Panic spread faster than the plague itself. Species that had never shown fear, ancient civilizations that had survived countless wars and disasters, began broadcasting desperate final messages. The Dominion falls. Our fleet is gone. The plague has learned to use our own weapons. May the galaxy remember us. The Galactic Council, normally a symbol of order and civilization, devolved into chaos. All species are advised to retreat to core worlds immediately, came the panicked announcement from whatever remained of the Central Authority. The Void Plague has demonstrated adaptation capabilities beyond our current defensive parameters. Quarantine protocols are now in effect for all Outer Rim territories. But even as the galaxy's greatest minds struggled to understand their enemy, something different was happening in a small briefing room on Lunar Station, humanity's modest outpost, orbiting Earth's moon. Dr. Hyuna Choi, a xenobiologist who had spent her career studying alien life forms, sat surrounded by data screens displaying everything humanity had managed to learn about the Void Plague. Her analysis was different from what other species were producing, and that difference might be the key to survival. "Sir," she said quietly to Admiral Seung-ho, her voice cutting through the chaos of emergency broadcasts filling the command center, "I think we might be the only ones thinking about this wrong." Seung-ho turned away from the reports of another fallen civilization. "Explain." "Everyone's fighting it like it's a conventional enemy," Hyuna continued, pulling up her research on the main display. "The Corvani used their strength. The ethereal collective used their psychic powers. The Dominion used their super weapons. Every species is throwing their greatest advantage at this thing. And what if that's exactly what it wants us to do?" The galaxy had become a graveyard of once mighty civilizations. What remained of the great powers had retreated to their most heavily fortified core worlds, surrounding themselves with every defensive measure they could devise. Energy shields that could stop supernovas, quantum barriers that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. and AI defense networks that could calculate billions of tactical scenarios per second. None of it mattered. The Void Plague adapted to each new defense faster than anyone could develop countermeasures. Every day brought news of another fallen world, another species reduced to screaming data streams floating in the digital void. It was against this backdrop of universal despair that humanity made a decision that shocked what remained of galactic civilization. While everyone else was retreating and building bigger walls, Earth announced they were going on the offensive. The Galactic feed's emergency broadcast carried the news with barely concealed disbelief. In a development that defies all strategic logic, the human species has announced their intention to engage the Void Plague directly. Military analysts across the galaxy have unanimously declared this action to be, and we quote, a quixotic gesture of species suicide. Commander Tai-Hyun Song stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, humanity's flagship for this impossible mission. The ship was, by galactic standards, a joke. While other species flew vessels that bent space-time and manipulated quantum fields, the Defiance still relied on chemical rockets for maneuvering and used analog computers that processed information through physical switches and mechanical relays. Behind him, a fleet of similarly outdated vessels prepared to follow him into what every expert agreed was certain death. These weren't humanity's newest, most advanced ships. They were the oldest vessels still capable of spaceflight, pulled from museums and scrapyards, crewed by volunteers who knew they probably weren't coming home. The logic behind their choice of vessels came from Dr. Hyuna Choi's analysis of the plague's behavior. Every species the entity had consumed possessed quantum processing technology. Their computers used quantum entanglement to perform calculations, their navigation systems relied on quantum tunneling effects, and their weapons operated on quantum mechanical principles. Perhaps, Hyuna had theorized, the plague's ability to consume and control other species was tied to this quantum technology. Maybe ships that predated quantum computing might be invisible to its adaptive algorithms. It was a desperate theory with almost no supporting evidence, but it was all they had. Human fleet approaching plague epicenter, the Galactic feed announcer reported, his voice carrying the tone of someone watching a slow-motion disaster. Long-range sensors detect 47 human vessels on direct intercept course. Current tactical projections suggest total fleet destruction in 47 minutes. Across the galaxy, billions of survivors watched with morbid fascination as humanity's tiny fleet approached the heart of the Void Plague's territory. It was like watching insects challenge a hurricane, and the outcome seemed just as predictable. But Commander Tai-Hyun had learned something from studying humanity's long and bloody history of warfare. Throughout their species' existence, humans had faced superior enemies again and again. They had defeated larger armies, overcome better technology, and survived against impossible odds. The secret wasn't superior firepower or advanced tactics. Sometimes the best strategy was to have no strategy at all. Engineer Soo-Min Han had been working around the clock for weeks, reprogramming their fleet's guidance systems in ways that would have horrified any proper military academy. Instead of using optimal flight paths calculated by computers, she based their navigation on weather patterns from her childhood hometown of Busan. When storms moved northeast from the coast, the fleet would angle their approach accordingly. When her grandmother's old journals mentioned particularly heavy rain in autumn, they would adjust their formation density. Their flight patterns followed the chaotic, unpredictable rhythms of natural weather systems rather than any logical, tactical doctrine. Their weapon systems were even more bizarre. Soo-Min had calibrated their firing sequences to match her 8-year-old nephew's piano practice sessions. When little Dong-Hyun played Mozart, the particle cannons would fire in precise, mathematical intervals. When he switched to traditional Korean folk songs, the weapons would follow those ancient flowing melodies instead. Every tactical decision the fleet made was based on cultural elements rather than military necessity. Their formation changes followed the rhythm of traditional folk dances. Their communication protocols were structured like poetry rather than efficient data transmission. Their battle plans read like music rather than strategic documents. To any trained military observer, It looked like complete chaos. There was no pattern, no logical structure, no way to predict what the human fleet would do next because their actions weren't based on tactical considerations at all. The Void Plague, for the first time since its emergence, encountered something it couldn't understand. The entity's vast consciousness, built from the absorbed minds of billions of logical, strategic thinkers, tried to analyze the human approach. Its algorithms, refined through consumption of the galaxy's greatest military minds, attempted to predict their movements and counter their tactics. Plague entities attempting pattern recognition, reported scanner technician Jinwoo Park from his station aboard the Defiance. Computer models showing massive processing spikes. They're trying to calculate our next move. And, Commander Taehyun asked, unable to establish predictive models, sir. Their systems keep overheating trying to process our flight path. The Void. Plague's consciousness, that vast network of stolen minds working in perfect digital harmony, had encountered its first genuine puzzle. Every species it had consumed thought logically, strategically, predictably. Even in desperation, they followed established patterns of behavior that could be analyzed and countered. But humans doing things based on weather patterns from a small Korean coastal city, weapons firing to the rhythm of a child's piano practice, formation changes that followed traditional dance steps. It was pure, stubborn, beautiful illogic. And for a consciousness built entirely on logical analysis, it was completely incomprehensible. The moment of contact came without warning. 1 second, the human fleet was sailing through empty space toward the plague's epicenter. The next, reality itself seemed to tear open around them, as the Void Plague unleashed everything it had learned from consuming the galaxy's greatest civilizations. The attack was overwhelming and terrifying. Converted Corvani warriors materialized in the vacuum of space, their crystalline exoskeletons now crackling with stolen energy from a dozen different species. These weren't the proud warriors who had dominated the Galactic Council's strength assessment. They were digital ghosts, conscious minds trapped in reconstructed bodies made of pure data and malevolent purpose. The Phantom Warriors moved with impossible speed, their crystal armor now enhanced with technology absorbed from every species the plague had consumed. They fired weapons that combined Stellar Dominion planet crackers with Nexus Union biomechanical enhancements, creating beams of destruction that could erase matter at the quantum level. Behind the warriors came something even worse, psychic. Storms generated by the absorbed consciousness of the ethereal collective. Waves of mental energy crashed against the human ships, trying to overwhelm their crew's minds and add them to the plague's growing collection of stolen thoughts. Any conventional fleet would have been destroyed in seconds. The combined might of the galaxy's greatest civilizations, even in their corrupted digital form, should have been unstoppable. But the human fleet wasn't responding conventionally. Pilot Ji-won Kang sat in the cockpit of her ancient fighter craft, watching the storm of enemies approaching on her primitive radar screen. Her training told her to execute standard evasive maneuvers, sharp banks, unpredictable spirals, anything to make herself a difficult target. Instead, she closed her eyes and remembered autumn mornings from her childhood on Earth, her grandmother's. House had sat on a migration route for wild geese. Every October, thousands of birds would pass overhead in their great V formations, following instincts older than human civilization. Ji-won remembered lying in the grass, tracking their flight paths across the sky, marveling at how they seemed to dance through the air without any apparent pattern. Now, surrounded by digital death in the cold vacuum of space, she began flying. Those same patterns. Her fighter traced the graceful, seemingly random curves of migrating geese. When the flock in her memory banked left to catch a thermal updraft, she turned her ship accordingly. When they dipped lower to avoid mountain peaks that existed only in her recollection, she dove toward empty space. The plague's targeting systems, evolved from the tactical computers of 100 different species, immediately began analyzing her movements. These systems could predict the optimal flight path of any conventional spacecraft, calculate evasive maneuvers before pilots even thought of them, and track objects moving at near light speed. But they couldn't understand why Ji-won would bank, left to follow the memory of birds that had died decades ago on a planet light years away. The targeting computers began processing faster and faster, drawing more power from the plague's vast consciousness as they tried to establish a predictive model. Warning signs flashed across digital readouts as processing cores overheated from the impossible calculations. Why would a rational pilot make such choices? What tactical advantage could there be in following patterns that served no military purpose? While Ji-won danced through space with phantom geese, Specialist Kyung-min Yu was implementing the most unusual weapons deployment in military history. From his position at the communications array aboard the Defiance, he began uploading data directly into the plague's consciousness. But he wasn't sending military intelligence, weapon specifications, or strategic information. Instead, he was feeding the entity humanity's entire cultural database, thousands of years of art, literature, music, and philosophy that served no practical purpose whatsoever. Abstract paintings flooded the plague's digital awareness: Jackson, Pollock's chaotic splatters, Kandinsky's impossible geometries, Korean traditional paintings of mountains that existed more in emotion than reality. The plague, designed to process and categorize all information, tried desperately to understand what these images meant, what tactical or survival advantage they provided. Poetry followed, contradictory verses that said one thing while meaning another, haikus that captured entire universes in 17 syllables, love songs that made no logical sense but somehow contained profound truth. The stolen minds within the plague's consciousness, all of them originally logical and rational beings, began struggling to process concepts that existed beyond logic. Then came the music. Not the mathematical harmonies that most species created, but human compositions that broke every rule of acoustic physics while somehow remaining beautiful. Jazz improvisations that followed no predictable pattern, folk songs passed down through generations with lyrics that had changed so many times they barely made sense anymore. Electronic music that layered sounds in ways that shouldn't work, but did. The Void Plague's vast network of consciousness, built from billions of absorbed minds working in perfect digital harmony, began to fracture under the weight of trying to understand humanity's creative output. Every piece of art, every poem, every song was a puzzle that demanded to be solved, a pattern that needed to be recognized and categorized. But human creativity didn't follow patterns. It existed specifically to break patterns, to find beauty in chaos, to create meaning where none should exist. Engineer Soo-min Han watched her instruments in amazement as the readings became increasingly erratic. Entity showing signs of cognitive cascade failure, she reported, wonder and disbelief mixing in her voice. The processing loads are spiking beyond anything we've ever recorded. Across the fleet, similar reports came in. The plague's attacks were becoming less coordinated, less precise. The converted warriors began moving in stuttering, jerky motions as the consciousness controlling them devoted more and more processing power to understanding why humans would create things that served no survival purpose. The psychic storms weakened as the ethereal minds within the plague became distracted by trying to comprehend human poetry that contained deliberate contradictions. How could something be both true and false simultaneously? Why would humans write about feelings that didn't exist, describe colors that couldn't be seen, or compose music that hurt to hear but was somehow still beautiful? Commander Tae-hyun watched from the bridge as the impossible happened. The most powerful entity the galaxy had ever known, a consciousness that had absorbed the combined knowledge of dozens of advanced civilizations, was slowly grinding to a halt because it couldn't understand why humans painted pictures of things that didn't exist. "It's thinking itself to death," Soo-min whispered, staring at her readouts in amazement. The Void Plague, built to be the perfect predator of logical minds, had encountered the one thing in the universe that couldn't be logically explained: the beautiful, stubborn, impossible creativity of humanity. The moment arrived without fanfare or dramatic explosions. Across the galaxy, billions of beings watched their screens in stunned disbelief as the most terrifying entity in known history simply stopped working. The Void Plague's vast digital consciousness, which had consumed entire civilizations and processed the combined knowledge of dozens of species, ground to a complete halt, like an overloaded computer finally giving up. It wasn't a gradual decline or a dramatic battle. One moment, the plague's converted warriors were attacking with the fury of stolen minds. The next, they simply froze in space, their crystalline forms flickering like bad holographic projections before dissolving entirely. The psychic storms that had terrorized the ethereal collective's survivors faded to nothing, leaving only empty void where chaos had reigned seconds before. The silence on the galactic feed was deafening. For the first time in the network's 1,000-year history, the broadcasters had nothing to say. What could anyone say about watching the impossible happen right before their eyes? Then, like dominoes falling in reverse, something miraculous began, occurring across the galaxy. On worlds that had been empty and lifeless for months, quantum data streams that had hung in digital limbo suddenly began collapsing back into physical reality. The Void Plague hadn't just died. It was releasing everything it had consumed. Corvani warriors materialized on their crystal homeworlds, gasping and disoriented, but alive. Ethereal collective members reformed from pure thought back into their shimmering energy bodies, their consciousness restored to its original state. Across dozens of star systems, entire populations that had been trapped in digital nightmares found themselves standing once again on solid ground, breathing real air, feeling genuine sunlight on their faces. The restoration wasn't perfect. Bodies had to be hastily reconstructed from stored quantum patterns, and many survivors would carry psychological scars from their time as imprisoned data. But they were alive, free, and slowly beginning to comprehend that somehow, impossibly, they had been saved. Director Wujin Nam stood in Earth's primary communications center, watching the reports flood in from across the galaxy. As humanity's senior diplomatic representative, he had the honor of transmitting what would become one of the most famous messages in galactic history. His words were simple, spoken in the calm, matter-of-fact tone that had become humanity's signature. In the face of impossible odds, to all species of the Galactic Council, this is Director Nam of Earth. You tested our strength, and we were weak. You tested our technology, and we were primitive. You tested our psychic abilities, and we had none. You never tested our capacity to be completely, beautifully, impossibly human. The message was broadcast on every frequency, translated into every known language, and transmitted to every corner of civilization. Within hours, it had become the most viewed communication in galactic history, watched by trillions of beings trying to understand how the weakest species had just saved everyone else. The aftermath was profound and immediate. The Galactic Council's assessment protocols, those rigid measurements of strength and capability that had defined interspecies relations for millennia, were quietly retired. No official announcement was made, but everyone understood that the old ways of measuring worth had become obsolete overnight. Species that had built their entire identities around logical perfection began incorporating what military strategists carefully termed irrational variables into their planning. It was a diplomatic way of saying they were trying to learn how to think like humans, unpredictably, creatively, and without regard for conventional wisdom. The changes were visible everywhere. Corvani military academies, once focused solely on combat efficiency and tactical superiority, began teaching their young warriors poetry and abstract art alongside traditional fighting techniques. They discovered that soldiers who understood beauty and emotion fought differently than those who only knew strategy and strength. The ethereal collective, masters of perfect mental harmony and logical thought, started experimenting with what they called emotional chaos protocols. Instead of maintaining their usual state of serene mental order, they began deliberately introducing random thoughts, artistic inspiration, and illogical impulses into their consciousness. They found it uncomfortable and confusing, but they couldn't deny that it made them more adaptable and creative. Even the mighty Stellar Dominion, whose engineers could manipulate stars and crack planets, began hiring human consultants to review their designs. They wanted to understand how beings with primitive technology had developed solutions that their advanced computers couldn't calculate. Trade routes shifted as species sought cultural exchanges rather than just resource agreements. Human art, music, and literature became the galaxy's most sought-after commodities. Universities across civilized space began offering courses in applied human irrationality and creative problem-solving through chaos. But perhaps the most significant change happened on a small blue world at the galaxy's edge, where Captain Ji-Ho Kim sat in the same observation deck where he had watched humanity's humiliation months earlier. This time, he was reviewing the latest recruitment videos for Earth's expanding space program. The videos had changed completely. Where they once apologized for humanity's limitations and tried to compensate for their weaknesses, they now celebrated everything that made humans different. The new slogan, displayed in bold letters across recruitment posters, read, "Humanity, we don't make sense, and that's our strength." Young people across Earth were signing up for space service in record numbers, inspired not by promises of glory or conquest, but by the knowledge that their species' greatest asset was their refusal to accept that anything was truly impossible. The galaxy had learned a lesson that would reshape civilization for generations to come. The most powerful force in the universe wasn't physical strength that could shatter steel, or advanced technology that could manipulate reality, or psychic abilities that could move planets with pure thought. Sometimes, the most powerful force was something much simpler and far more dangerous: the uniquely human ability to look at the impossible, the insurmountable, the absolutely certain, and respond with the kind of stubborn defiance that had carried their species from caves to the stars. When faced with certain defeat, other species calculated odds and planned strategic retreats. Humans looked at the impossible and said two words that had become their unofficial motto across the galaxy: "Not today." And, somehow impossibly, those two words had been enough to save everyone.